The plague arrived with the autumn mists, creeping through the valley like a living shadow. It began in the livestock, spreading through the cattle and sheep with merciless efficiency. Within days, the animals lay dead in their pens, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, eyes glazed with terror. Then it came for the children. Little Andre was the first, his small body racked with fever that no herb or prayer could break. His mother held him through 3 agonizing nights, whispering desperate pleas to God and the saints. But on the 4th morning, his bed was cold. The village of Argesh had weathered hardships before. Harsh winters, failed harvests, raids from neighboring territories. But this was different. This carried the stench of something unholy, something that defied the natural order. The sickness spread without pattern or reason, claiming the young and the old, the strong and the weak. Families buried their dead in hurried ceremonies, fear replacing grief as the only emotion they could afford. Father Constantine gathered the remaining villagers in the wooden church that stood at the heart of Argesh. The priest's face was gaunt, his hands trembling as he gripped the worn Bible. He had baptized most of these people, married them, blessed their children. Now he watched them die, powerless against an enemy he could neither see nor understand. The church was only half full. So many were already gone, or too weak to leave their beds. Elara sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap. At 23, she had never married, choosing instead to care for her aging father and younger brother after her mother's death 5 years prior. She was known in the village for her gentle nature and unwavering faith, often seen bringing food to the sick or sitting vigil with the dying. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her dress plain and mended in several places. She possessed a quiet beauty that came not from vanity, but from the compassion that seemed to radiate from within her. The elders sat in the front pew, their faces carved from years of sun and worry. Vasile, the oldest among them at 79, rose slowly to his feet. The church fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Vasile's voice was rough, weathered like ancient stone. He spoke of things the village had tried to forget, legends passed down through generations that most had dismissed as superstition. 20 years ago, he said, a group of young men from the village had ventured into the mountains, drunk on courage and foolishness. They had found an old crypt, its entrance marked with symbols none of them could read. Inside, they discovered a tomb of black marble, adorned with the crest of an ancient noble family. Ignoring the warnings carved into the stone, they had broken the seal, searching for treasure or glory or simply the thrill of defiance. They found nothing of value inside, only dust and darkness. But they had done something unforgivable. They had desecrated a sacred resting place, one that belonged to the bloodline of the Lord who ruled these mountains long before any of them were born. The Lord of Castle Bran, the immortal Count who commanded the night itself. Dracula. A collective shudder passed through the congregation. The name was spoken rarely, and never without a crossing of hearts and a whispered prayer. The castle stood high above them, perched on the mountain like a bird of prey, its towers visible on clear days as black fingers reaching toward heaven. Most pretended it did not exist. To acknowledge it was to invite its attention. But Vasile continued, his voice growing stronger with terrible certainty. The desecration had gone unpunished for 2 decades because the Count's patience was measured in centuries, not years. Now, he said, the debt had come due. The plague was no natural sickness. It was a curse, a deliberate punishment for the crime committed by their sons and brothers, and it would not stop until the debt was paid. Father Constantine tried to protest, to offer some alternative explanation, some hope rooted in divine mercy rather than ancient darkness, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. He had seen too many die, had heard too many final breaths rattle in chests that should have held decades more of life. He knew in his heart that Vasile spoke the truth. The old man revealed the price. It had come to him in a dream, he said. Though Elara suspected it was more than a dream, the Count required a sacrifice. Not just any death, but a willing surrender. A pure soul must offer itself to him freely, must walk to Castle Bran of their own choice, and submit to whatever fate he deemed fitting. Only then would the curse be lifted. Only then would the dying stop. The church erupted in anguished voices. Mothers clutched their surviving children. Men shouted their refusal, their defiance. A few wept openly. But beneath the chaos, Elara heard something else. She heard the sound of death approaching, patient and inevitable. She heard her 9-year-old brother's labored breathing from their cottage, where he lay fevered and weakening. She heard the silence that would follow if no one acted. She stood. The movement was quiet, but somehow it cut through the noise. Heads turned, eyes found her in the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. She would go. She would offer herself to the Count. She asked only that the village care for her father and brother after she was gone, that they be given food and shelter for as long as they lived. It was a small price for so many lives. The church exploded again, but this time with protests directed at her. Father Constantine rushed to her side, his face stricken. He could not allow this. She was too young, too good, too precious to throw away on a monster's demand. Her father, who had been sitting silently beside her, grabbed her arm with surprising strength. His weathered face was wet with tears. He forbade it. He would rather die, rather watch the whole village burn than lose his daughter to that creature. But Elara's mind was made. She had prayed about this very possibility from the moment Vasile began speaking, and she felt in her soul that this was her purpose. She had always believed that God gave each person a moment to prove their faith, to sacrifice something precious for the greater good. This was hers. She would not shrink from it. The argument continued for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against stone. But Elara remained unmoved. Finally, as the sun began to set and the church grew cold, Vasile silenced them all with a single raised hand. He looked at Elara with something like reverence mixed with profound sorrow. If this was her choice, he said, then the village would honor it. They would care for her family as she requested, and they would remember her name long after their own had been forgotten. The preparations were made quickly. There was no time to waste, Vasile insisted, though Elara suspected he feared she might change her mind if given too long to consider what lay ahead. She was given a simple white dress, the kind worn by brides or by maidens in old stories. Her hair was unbound and brushed until it fell in dark waves down her back. She was given no food, as was traditional for one undertaking a sacred journey, though she doubted there was anything sacred about walking into the arms of a vampire. Her father could not look at her as she prepared. He sat in their cottage, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her brother, Mihai, was barely conscious, his fever raging despite the cool cloths Elara pressed to his forehead. She whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, told him she would come back, told him to be strong. His fevered eyes seemed to see through her lies, but he smiled anyway, a weak flutter of his cracked lips. Father Constantine came to her as the last light faded from the sky. He wanted to give her final rites to bless her journey, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he pressed a small wooden cross into her palm, worn smooth from decades of worried fingers. He told her to remember that God's love followed her even into darkness, that no place was beyond his reach. Elara wanted to believe him. She tucked the cross into the bodice of her dress, feeling its slight weight against her heart. The villagers gathered to watch her leave, forming a silent corridor from her cottage to the northern road that led up into the mountains. No one spoke. Some wept. Others simply stared, their faces hollow with grief and guilt. Elara walked among them with her head high, though every step felt like walking through deep water. She focused on breathing, on moving forward, on not allowing herself to think about what waited at the end of this path. The road climbed steeply, winding through forests of pine and oak that grew twisted and dark as she ascended. The moon rose full and bloated, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Elara had never been this far from the village, had never dared venture toward the castle that loomed above them like a permanent storm cloud. The air grew colder with each step, biting through the thin fabric of her dress. Her bare feet, accustomed to the dirt paths of the village, struggled against the sharp stones of the mountain road. She walked for hours, the forest pressed close on either side, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, howls that were almost but not quite like wolves, rustling that suggested movement just beyond sight. Once she thought she saw eyes gleaming in the darkness, watching her progress. But when she looked directly at them, there was nothing but shadow. The road finally emerged from the trees onto a barren slope. And there, rising before her like a monument to damnation itself, stood Castle Bran. It was larger than she had imagined, a massive structure of black stone and iron, its towers piercing the sky like accusing fingers. No light showed in any window. No smoke rose from any chimney. It looked less like a dwelling and more like a tomb, a place where life itself had been forbidden entry. The gates stood open. Two massive doors of black iron, their surfaces covered in symbols and designs that hurt to look at directly. They had been waiting for her. Of course they had. He had known she would come. Elara paused at the threshold, her hand instinctively reaching for the cross hidden against her heart. She whispered a prayer, more breath than words, asking for courage she did not feel. Then she stepped through the gates into the courtyard beyond. The space was vast and empty, paved with stones so smooth they reflected the moonlight like still water. Dead vines climbed the walls, their leaves long since turned to dust. A fountain stood in the center, its basin dry and cracked. The castle itself loomed above, its windows like empty eye sockets staring down at her. She had taken perhaps 3 steps when she felt it. A presence, not seen but sensed, like pressure against her skin, like being watched by something that understood the texture of her soul. The air grew heavier, colder. Her breath came out in visible clouds. He appeared without sound or warning, simply there where nothing had been a moment before. Count Dracula stood at the top of the stone steps, leading to the castle's main entrance, looking down at her with eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. He was tall, impossibly so, his form wrapped in a long black cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. His face was pale as carved marble, beautiful in the way that ancient statues were beautiful, perfect and cold and utterly without warmth. His hair was dark, pulled back from a face that might have been 30 or 300, impossible to tell. But it was his eyes that held her frozen. They were dark, nearly black, but depths moved within them, centuries of hunger and cruelty and something else, something that might have once been human, but had been buried so deep it was barely a memory. Those eyes saw everything. They stripped away her courage, her faith, her very sense of self, leaving her feeling naked and small. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet over iron, cultured and ancient with an accent she could not place. He welcomed her. He said her name, Elara, drawing it out as if tasting it. He told her she was expected, that her sacrifice had been noted and would be accepted. He asked if she understood what she had offered, what price she had agreed to pay. Elara forced her voice to work, though it came out smaller than she intended. She said she understood. She had come to break the curse to save her village. She had come willingly, offering herself in exchange for their lives. The Count descended the steps with movements that were too smooth, too fluid, lacking the small imperfections that marked mortal motion. He circled her slowly, studying her as one might study an interesting painting or a particularly fine wine. He said she was beautiful in her innocence, radiant in her misguided faith. He said she believed she was making a noble sacrifice, giving her life for those she loved. How touching, how human. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from him. He reached out and lifted her chin with fingers that felt like ice, forcing her to meet his gaze. He told her the truth then, speaking with casual cruelty. He did not want her life. Life was cheap, fleeting, meaningless. What he wanted was so much more. He wanted her will, her choice, her capacity to defy him. He wanted her faith, that bright, burning thing inside her that believed in goodness and mercy and salvation. He wanted to extinguish it, slowly, carefully, until nothing remained but darkness and despair. He wanted to hollow her out and fill the empty spaces with himself, his hunger, his curse. He wanted to make her his creature, bound to him not by death, but by something far worse. Eternal, conscious submission. Only then, he said, when she had been completely unmade and remade in his image, when no trace of the girl who walked through his gates remained, only then would the village be spared. That was the price, not her death but her damnation. The cross against her heart felt suddenly heavy, burning almost. Elara wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to call on God and the saints and anyone who might hear. But her feet were frozen, her voice locked in her throat. She could only stare into those terrible eyes and understand, finally, the true horror of what she had done. She had not offered her life. She had offered her soul. And he had accepted. The castle swallowed her whole. Dracula led her through corridors that seemed to twist and multiply, passages that stretched longer than the exterior walls should have allowed. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, but their flames cast more shadow than light, creating a perpetual twilight that disoriented and confused. The air was thick with the scent of old stone and something else, something sweet and corrupt that made her stomach turn. They climbed a spiral staircase that wound upward for what felt like an eternity. Elara's legs burned with exhaustion, her bare feet leaving small prints of blood on the cold stone where sharp edges had cut her skin. The Count moved ahead of her with effortless grace, never looking back, confident in the knowledge that she would follow. Where else could she go? The castle itself seemed to conspire against escape, doors appearing and disappearing, windows showing views that couldn't possibly be real. Finally, they reached a chamber at the top of the western tower. Dracula pushed open a heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. The room beyond was surprisingly luxurious, a stark contrast to the barren corridors they had traversed. A massive canopied bed dominated one wall, its posts carved with intricate designs of vines and thorns. Heavy velvet curtains in deep crimson hung from the canopy and covered the windows. A wardrobe of dark wood stood against another wall, and a vanity with an ornate mirror occupied a corner. Candles burned throughout the room, dozens of them, casting dancing shadows across walls covered in faded tapestries depicting scenes of hunts and battles. The Count told her this would be her chamber. She would want for nothing in terms of physical comfort. Food would be brought. Though he suspected she would have little appetite, dresses appropriate to her new station would be provided. She was to consider herself not a prisoner but a guest, a permanent, eternal guest. Elara found her voice, though it trembled. She asked what he intended to do with her, what his plans entailed. She needed to understand the nature of her captivity. Dracula moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to reveal the valley far below. The village of Argesh was barely visible in the distance, a small cluster of lights against the vast darkness. He spoke without turning, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He told her that her transformation would be gradual, exquisite in its deliberation. He had centuries to work with after all. There was no need to rush. He would begin by isolating her, severing the connections that tied her to her former life. Already she was physically removed from everything she knew. Soon, the psychological separation would follow. He would appear to her at irregular intervals, sometimes going days without contact, then suddenly constant in his presence. This unpredictability would erode her sense of time and stability. He would speak to her of philosophy and darkness, planting seeds of doubt about the faith she clung to so desperately. He would show her the futility of mortal virtue, the emptiness of divine promises. He would offer her glimpses of power and eternity, temptations dressed as gifts. And when she was sufficiently weakened, sufficiently confused and desperate, he would begin the blood rituals, not to turn her into one of his kind. That was too simple, too quick. No, he would bind her to him through ceremonies that would tie her soul to his, making her dependent on his presence, his approval, his very existence. She would remain human, alive, but utterly his creature, incapable of defiance or independent thought. The Count turned to face her then, and his smile was terrible in its beauty. He told her she would beg for it eventually. She would plead for the release of total submission, for the peace of having no will of her own. And when that day came, when she knelt before him and offered not her body but her soul willingly, joyfully, the curse on the village would be lifted. That was the agreement. Total corruption in exchange for their salvation. He left her then, the door closing behind him with a sound like a tomb sealing. Elara stood frozen in the center of the room, her mind struggling to process what she had heard. She wanted to cry, to scream, to tear at her hair and beat her fists against the walls. But she was too numb, too overwhelmed by the enormity of her situation. Instead, She moved mechanically to the bed and sat on its edge, her hands folded in her lap in unconscious mimicry of how she had sat in the church just hours before. The cross was still pressed against her heart. She pulled it out, holding it in both hands, staring at the simple wooden surface, worn smooth by Father Constantine's constant prayers. She whispered every prayer she knew, every psalm she had memorized as a child, every plea for divine intervention she could remember. The words felt empty, swallowed by the darkness pressing in from all sides. But she continued anyway, because stopping meant admitting defeat, meant accepting that God had abandoned her to this place. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of her brother dying while she stood paralyzed, unable to reach him. She dreamed of her father's face twisted in accusation, blaming her for abandoning them. She dreamed of the Count's eyes, multiplied 1,000-fold, watching her from every shadow, seeing through flesh and bone to the terrified soul beneath. She woke to find morning light, pale and grey, filtering through the curtains. For a moment she felt hope. Sunrise meant the vampire would be forced to rest, unable to torment her during daylight hours. But then she noticed the food that had been left on a small table near the door. Bread, cheese, fruit, and wine in a crystal goblet. Someone, or something, had entered while she slept, and she had never stirred. The violation of that realization made her skin crawl. The days that followed blurred together into a monotonous routine of isolation. True to his word, the Count did not appear. Elara was left alone with nothing but her thoughts and fears for company. Meals appeared at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in what seemed like a day, sometimes not at all for what felt like days. The lack of routine, the inability to mark time's passage, began to wear on her. She tried to maintain prayers at regular intervals, using them as anchors to structure her existence, but without the sun's reliable movement or the ringing of church bells, she found herself losing track, repeating prayers or forgetting them entirely. The room, for all its luxury, became a prison of comfort. Everything was provided. Nothing was earned. She had no tasks, no purpose, no way to occupy her mind beyond endless circular thoughts that always returned to the same terrifying questions. Would the Count truly be able to break her? Was her faith strong enough to withstand whatever torments he devised? And most troubling of all, a question she barely dared acknowledge. What if he was right? What if the God she prayed to could not or would not reach her in this place? On what she thought might be the 5th day, though it could have been the 3rd or the 10th, the door opened. Dracula entered carrying a book bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. He told her he thought she might appreciate some reading material, something to occupy her obviously restless mind. He set the book on the table and left without another word. Elara approached the book cautiously, as if it might bite. The cover bore no title, only a symbol she didn't recognize. Inside, the pages were filled with text in Latin, a language she could read only haltingly thanks to Father Constantine's lessons. But the illustrations were clear enough. They depicted religious scenes, saints and martyrs and biblical events, yet something was wrong with them. The perspectives were distorted, the expressions on the faces subtly mocking. It was scripture filtered through a lens of corruption, faith presented as foolishness. She slammed the book shut and pushed it away, her hands shaking. This was the beginning, then, the subtle poisoning of her beliefs, presenting her with twisted versions of the truth she held dear. She refused to read more. She would not give him that victory. But as the hours stretched and the isolation pressed down like a physical weight, she found her eyes drifting back to the book. Not to read, she told herself, just to look at the craftsmanship, to have something to focus on besides the walls and her own spiraling thoughts. She opened it again, telling herself she would only glance at the illustrations, that she was strong enough to recognize the corruption for what it was. The text was insidious in its cleverness. It did not argue against God's existence or power. Instead, it questioned his mercy, his justice, his love for humanity. It presented theological arguments for why a truly benevolent deity would never have created such a flawed world, would never demand such suffering from his creations. It suggested that faith was not devotion, but delusion, a coping mechanism for minds unable to accept the cold indifference of the universe. Elara read one page, then another, telling herself she was only understanding the enemy's tactics, preparing counter-arguments. But the words burrowed into her mind like parasites, finding the small doubts she had always harbored but never voiced. Why had God taken her mother so young? Why did good people suffer while cruel ones prospered? Why had the plague been allowed to ravage her village in the first place? She spent hours arguing with the book's assertions in her mind, constructing defenses of her faith. But with no one to voice them to, no priest to reassure her, or fellow believers to share her convictions, the arguments felt hollow. She was debating with herself, and both sides knew all the weaknesses in her reasoning. When Dracula next appeared, he found her sitting at the table, the book open before her. He did not comment on this, did not gloat or press his advantage. He simply asked if she had found it interesting. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if they were two scholars discussing philosophy rather than predator and prey locked in a battle for her immortal soul. Elara wanted to spit at him, to throw the book in his face and declare her faith unshaken, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself asking questions, things that had troubled her as she read. She told herself she was challenging the book's premises, seeking to strengthen her faith by testing it. But part of her knew the truth. She was engaging with him, opening a dialogue which was exactly what he wanted. The Count sat across from her, settling into the chair with the ease of someone who had all the time in the world. He answered her questions with intelligence and depth, never condescending, never mocking. He treated her objections seriously, presenting counter-arguments that were logical and measured. He was not trying to batter down her faith with cruelty, but to gently, patiently dismantle it piece by piece with reason. They spoke for hours or perhaps minutes, time having lost all meaning in this place. Elara found herself almost forgetting who and what he was, caught up in the intellectual exercise. He was the most educated person she had ever conversed with, his knowledge spanning centuries of human thought and achievement. In another life, another world, she might have found such conversation exhilarating. When he finally left, taking the book with him, Elara felt exhausted and confused. She had held her own in the debate, or so she thought. She had defended her beliefs passionately, but she also realized she had enjoyed parts of it, the challenge of matching wits with an ancient intelligence, and that enjoyment felt like betrayal, like the first small crack in a dam that would eventually shatter completely. The pattern repeated over the following days. The Count would appear without warning, bringing books or maps or artifacts from his long existence. He would speak to her of history and art, of philosophy and science, always weaving in subtle challenges to her worldview. He never explicitly attacked her faith, but he contextualized it, presenting Christianity as one belief system among many, all equally valid or invalid depending on perspective. Elara tried to resist, tried to maintain her certainty. But isolation and constant intellectual assault were wearing her down. She had no reinforcement for her beliefs, no community of fellow faithful to remind her why she believed. She had only her own mind, and increasingly that mind was filled with doubts carefully cultivated by her captor. On what might have been the 10th night, or perhaps the 20th, Dracula came to her chamber with a different purpose. He told her it was time to begin the next phase. He had enjoyed their conversations, found her mind sharper than he had anticipated, but intellectual corruption, while satisfying, was not enough. It was time to introduce her to the physical realities of her new existence. He led her from her chamber, down corridors she had not traveled before, deeper into the castle's heart. They descended stairs that spiraled into darkness, passing through halls lined with portraits of pale figures whose eyes seemed to follow their movement. The temperature dropped with each level, until Elara's breath misted in the air, and her thin dress provided no protection against the cold. They emerged finally into a vast chamber far beneath the castle. The space was circular, its walls carved from living rock. Black candles burned in a ring around the room's perimeter, their flames somehow casting light that seemed darker than the shadows. In the center of the chamber stood an altar of black stone, its surface stained with substances Elara did not want to identify. Symbols covered every surface, carved into the walls, the floor, the altar itself, designs that hurt to look at directly. Dracula guided her to stand before the altar. His voice, when he spoke, echoed strangely in the space, as if multiple voices spoke in harmony. He told her this was where the binding would occur, where her soul would be tied to his through rituals older than civilization. But first, she needed to understand what she was being bound to. She needed to see him, not as he appeared, but as he truly was. The Count stepped back, spreading his arms wide. The transformation was gradual but terrible. His beautiful human facade began to crack like porcelain, revealing something beneath that made Elara's mind recoil. His eyes deepened into pools of absolute darkness, windows into an abyss that had no bottom. His teeth elongated, becoming the fangs of nightmare designed to tear and rend. His fingers extended into claws, black and sharp as obsidian. The humanity he wore like a mask fell away, exposing the predator underneath, the ancient hunger that had consumed countless lives over countless centuries. But worst of all was the overwhelming sense of wrongness that radiated from his true form. This was a creature that should not exist, that violated the natural order simply by being. It was death given consciousness, corruption given purpose, and Elara was to be bound to this thing, tied to it in ways that would make her complicit in everything it was and did. She could not help it. She screamed. The sound tore from her throat, primal and terrified, echoing through the chamber and the corridors beyond. Her legs gave out and she collapsed, her mind unable to process what stood before her. Dracula allowed the scream to fade before resuming his human appearance. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle, touched with something that might have been pity in a creature capable of such emotion. He told her that now she understood. Now she knew exactly what she had offered herself to, and still the choice remained. She could submit to the binding, complete her sacrifice, and save her village, or she could refuse, condemn herself to eventual madness in isolation, while the plague continued its work below, and ultimately be bound anyway once her will was completely broken. Either way, he said, she would be his. The only question was how much suffering would precede that inevitable conclusion. He gave her until the next new moon to decide. That was 10 days, though he suspected she would make her choice much sooner. Breaking a human spirit rarely required patience. Only consistent pressure applied to the right points. He left her there in the ritual chamber, alone with the black candles and the stained altar, and the terrible knowledge of what awaited her. Elara curled into herself on the cold stone floor, her body racked with sobs that seemed to have no end. The cross was still against her heart, but it felt like a lie now, a false promise of protection that had already failed. She was in hell, she realized. Not the metaphorical hell of Scripture, but a real, tangible hell made of stone and shadow and ancient evil. And worst of all, deepest in her heart, where she barely dared acknowledge it, a tiny treacherous voice whispered that perhaps submission would be a mercy. Perhaps the peace of having no choices, no will, no responsibility for her own damnation would be preferable to this constant terror and struggle. Perhaps the Count was right, and fighting was only prolonging the inevitable. She hated that voice, hated the weakness it represented. But she could not silence it. And with each passing moment, in the darkness beneath Castle Bran, it grew louder. Time became meaningless in the depths of Castle Bran. Elara was returned to her chamber after the ritual room, but something fundamental had shifted. She could no longer pretend ignorance about what she faced. The Count's true form haunted her every waking moment and invaded her dreams with relentless persistence. Sleep offered no escape, only different variations of the same nightmare, watching those human features crack and fall away to reveal the monster beneath. She stopped eating. The food that appeared in her chamber remained untouched, congealing on silver plates. Her body weakened, but her mind paradoxically grew sharper, hyper-focused on the approaching deadline. 10 days until the new moon. 10 days to decide between submission and continued resistance. But what resistance meant, she was no longer certain. Was it truly resistance if the outcome was predetermined? Was there nobility in suffering when the end would be the same regardless? Father Constantine's cross had become her only anchor. She held it constantly, fingers wrapped so tightly around the wood that splinters embedded in her palm. She prayed ceaselessly, words tumbling from her lips in an unending stream. But the prayers had changed. Where once they had been pleas for deliverance, Now they were negotiations, bargains struck with a god who seemed impossibly distant. She promised greater faith if he would send a sign. She swore lifelong devotion if he would give her the strength to endure. She begged for understanding of his purpose in bringing her to this place. No signs came. No strength manifested. No understanding dawned. There was only silence, and in that silence, the Count's words echoed with increasing authority. Dracula visited her every night. Though she could no longer distinguish night from day in her windowless routine, he would enter without knocking, moving through the locked door as if it were insubstantial. Sometimes he brought gifts, beautiful dresses of silk and velvet in colors that reminded her of blood and midnight. Other times he brought books, always carefully selected to undermine some aspect of her worldview. Once, he brought a mirror and held it before her, forcing her to confront her own deterioration. The face staring back was barely recognizable. Her cheeks had hollowed, her eyes had sunken into dark circles, her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. She looked like the dying villagers she had tended before coming to the castle. She looked like someone already halfway to the grave. The Count's reflection, of course, did not appear in the glass. He stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his voice in her ear telling her that this was what resistance looked like. This was the price of clinging to false hope. Submission, he whispered, would restore her. It would give her purpose and peace. Why choose suffering when comfort was offered? He spoke to her of the villagers, describing in detail how they continued to die despite her sacrifice. The plague had slowed, he admitted, but not stopped. Each night, another grave was dug, another family destroyed. Her father had fallen ill now, he said, watching her face for reaction. And young Mihai grew weaker daily, his fever unbroken despite the herbs and prayers poured over him. Her sacrifice was failing because it was incomplete. Until she surrendered fully, totally, the curse would maintain its hold. Elara wanted to call him a liar, to dismiss his words as manipulation, but she could feel the truth in them, taste it like ash on her tongue. Of course the curse continued. She had not fulfilled her end of the bargain. She had offered herself but was withholding the crucial element, her willing acceptance of damnation. The Count required not just her presence but her complicity, and every day she resisted was another day her village suffered. The guilt was exquisite torture, more effective than any physical pain could have been. She was responsible for their continued anguish. Her stubborn faith, her desperate clinging to her soul's integrity, was costing lives. What right did she have to value her own salvation above the survival of everyone she loved? Was that not the ultimate selfishness, to condemn others for the sake of her own spiritual purity? These thoughts consumed her, eating away at her resolve like acid through cloth. She found herself composing arguments against her own position, identifying the logical flaws in her resistance. The Count had been right about so much already. His predictions of her isolation and confusion had proven accurate. His philosophical arguments had revealed contradictions in her faith she could not resolve. Perhaps he was right about this as well. Perhaps submission was not damnation, but acceptance of reality, acknowledgement that some battles were not meant to be won. On what she believed to be the seventh night, Dracula came to her chamber with a different demeanor. He carried with him a chalice of worked silver, its bowl filled with dark liquid that caught the candlelight like liquid ruby. He told her he would perform the first binding ritual tonight, a preliminary ceremony that would create the initial connection between them. It was not yet the complete surrender he required, but a step toward it. She could still refuse, of course. But if she participated, even partially, some of the curse's weight would lift, some of the dying would stop. It would be mercy bought with compromise. Elara stared at the chalice, understanding immediately what it contained. Blood. His blood, ancient and corrupt, carrying centuries of death and darkness. To drink it would be to take part of him into herself, to blur the line between victim and accomplice. It would be a violation of everything she believed, everything she was, and yet, if it saved even one life in the village, one child who might otherwise perish, could she refuse? The Count set the chalice on the table and stepped back, giving her space to choose. He did not pressure or threaten. He simply waited, patient as stone, confident in the inevitability of her surrender. The silence stretched, broken only by Elara's ragged breathing and the distant howl of wind through the castle's towers. She reached for the chalice. Her hand trembled so violently that the liquid sloshed against the silver rim. She brought it halfway to her lips before her nerve failed. She set it down sharply, dark drops spattering across the white tablecloth. She could not. No matter the cost, no matter who suffered, she could not willingly damn herself. It was too much. God would have to forgive her weakness, but this was a line she could not cross. Dracula's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or was it respect? He took the chalice and poured its contents onto the floor, the blood soaking into the ancient wood with disturbing eagerness. He told her she had chosen suffering then, for herself and for those below. He hoped she could live with that choice, though he suspected the living would prove more difficult than the dying. He left her alone with her guilt and her cross and the stain on the floor that refused to fade, no matter how she scrubbed at it with her dress hem. She collapsed onto the bed, her body exhausted beyond measure, her spirit fractured into pieces that no longer fit together properly. She tried to pray, but the words would not come. Her mind was empty, scoured clean by fear and guilt, and the terrible knowledge that she was failing everyone who depended on her. Sleep came eventually, dragging her down into darkness. She dreamed of the village, but it was changed. The cottages were empty, the streets deserted. She walked through a graveyard that stretched to the horizon, countless wooden crosses marking countless graves, and at each one her name was carved. Elara, 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 1,000 accusations in a single name. She woke to find herself no longer in her chamber, but in the ritual room deep beneath the castle. The black candles burned around her in their circle, their dark light making shadows dance across the carved walls. She was lying on the altar, her white dress arranged as if for viewing, her hands folded across her chest in the manner of a corpse. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, to escape, but her body would not respond. She was paralyzed, conscious but immobile, trapped in her own flesh. Dracula emerged from the shadows beyond the candles. He told her not to be afraid, that he had simply brought her here while she slept to show her something important. He wanted her to experience what the binding would feel like, to understand exactly what she was refusing. Knowledge, he said, should inform choice. Ignorance was no virtue. He began to chant in a language that predated human civilization, words that felt wrong to hear, that seemed to crawl inside her ears and nest in her brain. The candles flared brighter, their flames growing until they merged into a single ring of fire surrounding the altar. Elara felt something stir in the air, a presence ancient and malevolent, drawn by the ritual's power. This was not divine, not holy. This was something that existed in opposition to creation itself. The Count placed his hand over her heart, his palm cold through the thin fabric. She felt her heartbeat synchronize with his touch, felt something try to flow from him, into her. It was invasive, violating, like being filled with ice water that burned. She screamed silently, unable to give voice to her terror, as the foreign presence pushed against her soul, testing boundaries, seeking entry. And then abruptly it stopped. The chanting ceased. The candles returned to their normal flames. Dracula removed his hand and stepped back. He told her that was merely the sensation of the preliminary binding, the gentlest touch of what was to come. The full ritual would be 1,000 times more intense, would remake her from the inside out. If she thought she could endure it through resistance, she was deluding herself. No human will was strong enough to maintain integrity through that process. She would break. The only question was whether she broke before or after, whether she came to him willingly or shattered. Elara found herself back in her chamber, sprawled on the floor beside her bed. Had it been real or nightmare? The distinction no longer seemed to matter. Real or imagined? The experience had accomplished its purpose. She now knew with visceral certainty what awaited her, and the knowledge was more terrible than any ignorance could have been. The remaining days blurred together. The Count's visits increased in frequency and intensity. He would speak to her for hours, his voice a constant presence undermining every certainty she possessed. He described her village in detail, telling her of specific deaths, naming names, describing the grief of families torn apart. Her father had died, he said, calling out for her with his final breath, unable to understand why his daughter had abandoned him. Mihai survived but was changed, made bitter and cold by his sister's betrayal. The boy who had looked at her with such love and trust now spat her name like a curse. Each revelation, true or false, carved away another piece of her resolve. She was responsible. Her stubborn faith, her selfish desire to preserve her own soul, had destroyed the very people she claimed to love. What kind of God would demand such a price? What kind of salvation was worth such suffering? The Count's arguments, once easily dismissed, now seemed to carry undeniable weight. On the night before the new moon, Elara knelt before the small wooden cross, trying one final time to pray. But the words that came were not prayers. They were accusations. Why had God brought her here if not to submit? Why give her the burden of saving the village if not to see it through? Why instill in her such love for others if her love meant choosing their damnation over her own? Nothing made sense. Faith, which had once provided answers and comfort, now offered only confusion and pain. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn. She knew who it was. The Count's voice when he spoke was softer than she had ever heard it, almost kind. He told her the choice was upon her. Tomorrow night, with the new moon's arrival, the ritual would occur whether she consented or not. He had given her time, more than most received, to come to understanding. But time's generosity had limits. If she submitted willingly tonight, he said, the curse would break immediately. The plague would vanish as if it had never been. The dead could not be restored, but the dying would recover. The village would rebuild. Her sacrifice would not have been in vain. She would lose herself, yes, but she would gain the certainty that her damnation purchased their salvation. There was peace in that, a form of martyrdom that even her God might recognize. If she refused, if she maintained her resistance, the ritual would proceed regardless, but it would be violent, torturous, a breaking rather than a bending, and the curse would continue until every soul in Argesh was claimed. Because her unwilling submission held no power, she would be damned and they would die. Everyone would lose. Only her pride would be satisfied, the hollow victory of having said no even as everything burned. Dracula moved to stand before her, looking down at her kneeling form with those ancient, terrible eyes. He asked what she chose, salvation or pride, love or faith, the village or her soul. He needed her answer before dawn broke, before the final day began. He needed to know which version of the ritual to prepare. Elara looked up at him, tears streaming down her hollowed cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, to give voice to the decision that would define eternity, but the words would not form. She was suspended between impossible choices, paralyzed by the weight of consequences either path would bring. In that moment, she understood the true cruelty of what the Count had designed. It was not the damnation itself that destroyed her. It was the forcing of choice, the making her complicit in her own destruction, the elimination of every path except the one that led to his victory. She could only whisper, broken and defeated, that she did not know. She did not know what to choose. She did not know what was right. She did not know if her God existed, or had abandoned her, or had never been there at all. She knew nothing except that she was afraid and alone, and so very tired of fighting. The Count smiled, and there was something like satisfaction in his expression. He told her that uncertainty was closer to submission than she realized. Doubt was the first crack in faith's armor. By morning, he suspected, she would have her answer. And he would be waiting, patient and eternal, to receive whatever choice she made. He left her there, kneeling in the candlelight with her cross clutched in bleeding hands, suspended in the final hours before the new moon brought its reckoning. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Elara remained kneeling long after the Count departed, her body rigid with tension, her mind a battlefield where every conviction she had ever held fought for dominance. The candles in her chamber burned lower, wax pooling on the surfaces beneath them, marking time in a way the absence of sun and stars could not. Each drop that fell felt like another moment stolen, another breath closer to the irrevocable choice that awaited her with the new moon's arrival. She tried to pray, but every attempt dissolved into formless pleading. The structured prayers of her childhood, once so comforting in their familiar rhythms, now seemed like empty recitations, words without power or meaning. She had repeated them so often in this place that they had lost their shape, become sounds divorced from significance. Instead, she spoke directly, voice cracking in the silence, asking God why he had forsaken her, why he had led her to this castle only to abandon her in its depths. Was this a test of faith, like Abraham with Isaac, where mercy would arrive at the final moment? Or was it punishment for some sin she could not name, retribution disguised as sacrifice? No answer came. There was only the oppressive quiet of stone and shadow, broken occasionally by distant sounds that might have been wind or might have been the movement of things better left uncontemplated. The castle itself seemed to be waiting, holding its breath in anticipation of what the coming night would bring. As what she thought might be dawn approached, though she had no way to verify the passage of time, Elara finally rose from her knees. Her joints protested, stiff from hours of immobility. She moved to the window and drew back the heavy curtain, half expecting to see daylight, some confirmation that the world beyond these walls still operated according to natural law. Instead, she found only darkness, thick and absolute. Either it was still night, or the window looked out onto nothing, a void where reality ceased to function. She let the curtain fall closed and turned away, stomach churning with nausea born of exhaustion and fear. Food had been left while she prayed, a plate of bread and fruit that looked almost obscenely wholesome in this place of death and corruption. Her body demanded sustenance, animal need overriding spiritual crisis, and she forced herself to eat. The bread was fresh, still warm somehow, and tasted of nothing. She chewed mechanically, swallowing without tasting, fueling flesh that would soon belong to another regardless of what choice she made. As she ate, unbidden memories surfaced. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years from a fever that had taken her in 3 terrible days. Elara had been 18 then, thrust suddenly into the role of caretaker for her father and brother. She remembered her mother's final words, whispered through cracked lips, telling her to be strong, to have faith, to trust that God's plan was greater than human understanding, even when it seemed cruel and senseless. At the time, Elara had clung to those words like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. They had sustained her through grief and hardship, given her purpose and direction. Now they felt like chains. Be strong, have faith, trust God's plan. What plan could this possibly serve? What greater good could emerge from her damnation? If this was divine will, then divinity itself was corrupt, no better than the monster who ruled this castle. And if it was not divine will, if God truly opposed what was happening here, then where was his intervention? Where was the angel with the flaming sword, the pillar of fire, the miraculous deliverance promised to the faithful? The logical conclusion, the one she had been avoiding with desperate intensity, forced itself into consciousness. Perhaps there was no plan. Perhaps there was no God. Or if he existed, he was as distant and indifferent as the stars. Perhaps all of human history, all the prayers and sacrifices and martyrdoms, had been nothing more than elaborate self-deception, comforting lies told to make existence bearable. Perhaps the Count was right, and she was simply the latest fool to learn that faith was weakness dressed as virtue. The thought should have been liberating. If there was no God to damn her, then there was no damnation to fear. Submission would be merely pragmatic, a transaction made to save lives with no eternal consequences. But instead of relief, Elara felt only desolation. If faith was illusion, then so was everything she had built her identity upon. She would be giving up not just her soul, but herself, admitting that the core of her being had been constructed from nothing. It was annihilation either way, whether divine punishment or existential meaninglessness. She was drowning in these thoughts when the door opened yet again. But this time, it was not the Count who entered. A woman stood in the doorway, young and beautiful, dressed in a gown of deep emerald that seemed to shift and shimmer in the candlelight. Her hair was pale as moonlight, falling in waves past her shoulders, and her skin had the same marble quality as Dracula's. Her eyes, however, were different. Not the absolute darkness of the Count, but rather a deep amber that held something almost like warmth. The woman introduced herself as Katarina, and her voice carried an accent that marked her as from distant lands, places Elara had only heard of in travelers' tales. She had been where Elara now stood, she said, though her own arrival at Castle Bran had occurred 3 centuries past. She had been offered as tribute by her city, a merchant's daughter sacrificed to end a siege. She too had resisted, had prayed, had believed rescue would come. It never had. Elara stared at this apparition, trying to determine if she was hallucination or reality. The woman seemed solid enough, her footsteps making soft sounds on the floor as she moved deeper into the chamber. She sat in the chair opposite Elara, arranging her skirts with casual grace, and studied the girl before her with something that might have been compassion. Katarina spoke of her own transformation, how the Count had been more brutal in earlier centuries, less patient with human fragility. She had been broken through pain rather than persuasion, her will shattered like glass. The process had taken weeks of torture, both physical and mental, until she had begged for the binding simply to make the agony stop. And when it was complete, when she had become his creature fully and finally, the promised peace had never arrived. There was only numbness, a hollow existence where she performed her duties without question or thought. A living puppet animated by strings she could no longer see or feel. But over the centuries, Katarina said, something unexpected had occurred. The numbness had gradually, almost imperceptibly, lifted. She began to think again, to feel again, though the emotions were muted and strange. She remained bound to the Count, unable to disobey or defy him, but within those constraints she had found small spaces of autonomy. She could choose which book to read, which dress to wear, which window to stare from during the endless nights. They were tiny freedoms, meaningless to anyone who had never lost all choice, but to her they were treasures beyond price. She leaned forward, her amber eyes intense, and told Elara the truth the Count would never speak. The binding was not absolute. It could not eliminate the soul entirely, only suppress it, constrain it, force it into channels deemed acceptable by the master. But the soul itself endured, battered and diminished but not destroyed. If Elara was strong enough, clever enough, patient enough, she could survive with fragments of herself intact. It would be a half-life, a shadow of what she had been, but it would be something. She would not be completely lost. Elara wanted to find hope in these words, but they offered only a different flavor of despair. To spend eternity as a diminished thing, a broken creature scrabbling for scraps of autonomy, was that truly better than the annihilation she feared? Was existing as the Count's puppet, even with moments of pseudo-consciousness, preferable to non-existence? She asked Katarina why she was here, why she risked the Count's anger by offering information that might strengthen resistance. The pale woman smiled, and there was bitterness in the expression. She said the Count had sent her, of course. Nothing happened in this castle without his knowledge and permission. This too was part of the process, showing Elara that even submission offered no true peace, that every path led to suffering of one kind or another. It was meant to paralyze her with hopelessness, to make the choice seem arbitrary, since all outcomes were terrible. But Katarina added, speaking quickly and quietly, as if afraid of being overheard, that she was also here of her own limited volition. The Count's control was not perfect, especially over those bound for centuries. There were cracks, small spaces where individual will could still operate. She wanted Elara to know the truth, all of it, so that whatever choice was made came from full understanding rather than ignorance. And she wanted to warn her of something the Count had not revealed. The ritual that awaited with the new moon was designed to break Elara regardless of consent. Whether she submitted or resisted, the process would shatter her mind and spirit. The difference lay only in what would be rebuilt from the pieces. Willing submission meant the Count would reconstruct her as something that believed itself content, that accepted its servitude as right and proper. Resistance meant he would rebuild her as something that knew it had been broken, that remembered fighting and losing, that existed in permanent awareness of its own defeat. Both versions would serve him equally, but one would suffer consciously, while the other would suffer in ignorance of its suffering. Elara felt the walls closing in, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. There was no escape then, no choice that led to anything but destruction. Katarina was offering her only the selection of which destruction to endure, which version of damnation to inhabit. It was no choice at all, merely the illusion of agency granted to make the victim complicit in their own fate. The pale woman rose to leave, her purpose fulfilled. But at the door she paused and looked back. She said there was one other possibility, though she hardly dared speak it aloud. In 300 years she had heard whispers among the other bound servants, of those who had found a third path. Instead of submitting or resisting, they had done something the Count did not anticipate. They had embraced the ritual fully, diving into it rather than being dragged, and in that surrender had found a kind of transcendence. Not freedom, never freedom, but a state beyond suffering where the self dissolved entirely into something else, something neither human nor vampire but other. It was said to be like death but conscious, like sleep but eternal, like peace but empty. Whether this was truth or myth or mad hope, Katarina did not know, but she offered it as one final piece of information, one more weight for Elara to place on the scale of her impossible decision. Then she was gone, vanishing as silently as she had appeared, leaving Elara alone once more, with thoughts that chased themselves in spirals of despair and confusion. The hours continued their relentless march. The new moon drew closer with each heartbeat, and still Elara did not know what she would choose. Only that the choosing itself had become a torture more exquisite than anything the Count could devise. She found herself pacing the chamber, unable to remain still, her mind a cacophony of competing voices. Her mother's voice urging faith, Father Constantine's voice promising divine love, her brother's voice calling her name in fever dreams. The Count's voice weaving logic and seduction into chains that tightened with every word. And beneath them all, her own voice, growing fainter with each passing moment, struggling to be heard above the noise, asking the one question that mattered most. Who was she? Not who others wanted her to be, not who faith or duty or love demanded she become, but who she truly was in the core of her being when all else was stripped away. She realized with clarity that felt like a blade to the heart that she did not know. Her identity had been built from external forces, shaped by her roles as daughter, sister, believer, caretaker. She had never existed as simply Elara, separate from context and obligation. Perhaps that was why the Count's assault had been so effective. There was no solid core to defend, only a collection of adopted virtues and inherited beliefs that crumbled under sustained pressure. If she did not know who she was, how could she decide what she was willing to sacrifice? How could she weigh her soul's value when she had never examined what that soul actually contained? The questions spiraled deeper, becoming philosophical puzzles that had no answers. Only more questions branching into infinity. The door opened once more. The Count stood framed in the doorway, and even without looking at the candles, Elara knew it was time. The new moon had arrived. The final hour had come. He did not speak, did not need to. His presence was question enough. She had to answer now, one way or another, with words or silence, with action or paralysis. The moment of choice, endlessly deferred, had finally arrived and would not be postponed again. Elara looked at him, this ancient creature who had devoted such care and attention to her destruction, and felt a strange sense of disconnect. It was as if she was watching herself from outside her body, a spectator to her own fate. She saw herself standing there, small and broken and lost, a girl who had walked into the castle believing in sacrifice and salvation, now barely able to remember why those words had once meant something. She opened her mouth to speak, to give voice to the decision that would define her existence or end it, but what emerged was not acceptance or defiance. It was a question, simple and terrible in its implications. She asked the Count what he would do if she chose neither path, if she refused both submission and resistance, if she simply stopped participating in the game entirely. What if she offered him nothing, not her surrender or her struggle, but only apathy, indifference, the void of someone who had ceased to care about outcomes? The Count's expression shifted, something flickering across his perfect features too quickly to identify. Surprise, perhaps, or was it concern? He told her that stillness was impossible, that neutrality was a fantasy. The ritual would proceed, and she would react, and that reaction would determine the shape of what followed. She could not opt out of existence simply by withdrawing consent. Reality did not work that way. But even as he spoke, Elara sensed uncertainty in his words. She had found something he had not prepared for, a response outside the binary he had so carefully constructed. It was not hope, not exactly, but it was possibility, a thin crack in the wall of inevitability he had built around her. And in that crack, in that moment of his hesitation, she found the strength to speak one final truth. She told him she did not know what she chose, that she could not know, that the person capable of choosing had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but questions and fear. But she would enter the ritual regardless, because remaining in this liminal space was its own kind of death. Whatever happened in that chamber beneath the castle, whatever she became or ceased to be, at least it would be resolution. The torture of uncertainty would end. And perhaps in the dissolution of self that awaited, she would finally find the answer to who she had been, even if only in the negative space of who she was no longer. The Count studied her for a long moment, and she could not read what moved behind those dark eyes. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. He told her to follow him. The ritual chamber was prepared. The time had come to discover what remained when everything was stripped away. He turned and walked into the corridor, confident in her pursuit. Elara took one final look at the chamber that had been her prison, and, in a strange way, her sanctuary. She looked at the cross still clutched in her hand, Father Constantine's final gift. She brought it to her lips and kissed the worn wood, not in prayer, but in farewell. Then she set it carefully on the table, abandoning the last physical connection to the faith that had failed to save her. And she followed the Count into the darkness, walking with steady steps toward the ritual that would unmake her, curious despite her terror to learn what truth lay at the center of the destruction he had promised. The descent into the ritual chamber felt different this time. Where before Elara had been dragged by fear and confusion, now she walked with something approaching calm, the resignation of one who has exhausted all possibilities and found them equally empty. The corridors seemed shorter, the stairs less numerous, as if the castle itself sensed the approaching culmination and hastened to deliver her to it. Or perhaps her perception of time had fractured so completely that distance and duration had lost all meaning. It did not matter. Nothing mattered except the momentum carrying her forward. The black candles still burned in their circle, their flames unchanged despite what must have been days since she last saw them. The altar stood waiting, its surface stained and scarred by centuries of use. The symbols carved into every surface seemed to writhe in the flickering light, forming patterns that her eyes could not quite follow, geometry that defied rational comprehension. The air was thick with incense, cloying and sweet, mixed with something metallic that coated the back of her throat. Dracula moved to stand beside the altar, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. He had shed his human affectation of casual lordship and now appeared in his full regalia as master of this place. His clothing was archaic, the formal attire of nobility from centuries past, all black fabric and silver threading that caught the light like captured starlight. His face was severe, beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a carved idol given breath and purpose. He told her to approach, to take her place upon the altar. His voice echoed strangely in the chamber, as if speaking from multiple directions simultaneously. Elara obeyed, moving with slow steps across the stone floor. The surface of the altar was cold against her back as she lay upon it, staring up at the vaulted ceiling lost in shadows above. The position was vulnerable, explosive, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But she remained still, watching as the Count began preparations for the ritual that would end her existence as she knew it. He produced items from the shadows, objects she had not noticed in her previous visits. A chalice of worked silver, twin to the one he had offered her before. A dagger with a blade of black glass that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. A book bound in something that looked disturbingly like skin, its pages covered in script that predated language as she understood it. He arranged these items with precise care on a smaller table beside the altar, each placement deliberate and significant. Then he began to chant. The words were not Latin or any tongue she recognized. They were older, harsher, sounds that seemed torn from the throat rather than spoken. The candles flared in response, their flames growing until they nearly touched the ceiling, casting everything in shades of crimson and shadow. Elara felt the temperature drop, her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The symbols on the walls began to glow with faint phosphorescence, pulsing in rhythm with the Count's chanting. Something was entering the chamber, drawn by the ritual's power. Elara could not see it directly, but she sensed its presence, vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. It was not the Count, though it was connected to him. It was the source of his power, the darkness he served, and that served him in turn. And it was hungry, eager for what was about to be offered. Dracula took up the black glass dagger, holding it high so that the blade caught the candlelight. He spoke directly to Elara now, his voice cutting through the chanting like a knife through silk. He told her this was the moment of transformation. The blade would open her, not just her flesh, but the barriers that separated her soul from his influence. His blood, mixed with hers in the chalice, would create a bond that transcended mere physical connection. And the words of binding, spoken in the language of the first darkness, would seal her fate irrevocably. He asked one final time if she submitted willingly, or if he must proceed through force. The question was ritual more than genuine inquiry. They both knew she had moved beyond choice into a space where will itself had dissolved. But the forms must be observed. The ritual demanded acknowledgement. Elara found her voice, though it seemed to come from very far away, as if someone else was speaking through her throat. She said she neither submitted nor resisted. She offered herself not as sacrifice but as question, surrendering her existence to discover what lay beneath the layers of self and faith and fear. She did not ask for mercy or deliverance. She asked only for truth, whatever form that truth might take. Something flickered across the Count's face, an emotion too complex and fleeting to name. Then he nodded and brought the blade down. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything she had imagined possible. It was not merely physical, though that was agonizing enough, but metaphysical, as if the dagger cut through the substance of her being itself. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat in a raw howl that echoed through the chamber and beyond. Up through the castle, out into the night where it mingled with the wind and the howls of distant wolves. Blood welled from the wound, more than should have been possible, flowing across the altar's surface in rivulets that followed the carved channels toward collection points at the corners. Dracula held the chalice beneath one of these flows, catching her blood as it streamed forth. When the cup was half full, he raised his own wrist to his mouth. His fangs, fully extended now, punctured his pale flesh with practiced ease. His blood, dark as ink, flowed to mingle with hers in the chalice. The mixture began to smoke and bubble, reacting to forces beyond chemistry or physics. The Count stirred it with the dagger's blade, continuing his chanting as the liquid transformed from red to black to something that seemed to shift between all colors and none. Then he brought the chalice to Elara's lips, tilting it so that the contents flowed into her mouth. She tried to resist, to turn her head away, but her body no longer obeyed her commands. The liquid poured down her throat, burning like acid and freezing like ice simultaneously. It spread through her body in waves, invading every cell, rewriting the fundamental code of her existence. She felt herself being unmade, pulled apart at the seams, consciousness fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that scattered like leaves in a storm. And in that dissolution, in that moment of complete annihilation, she found what she had been seeking. Beneath the layers of identity and belief, beneath the roles and expectations and fears, there was something essential. It was not a soul in any way she had been taught to understand. It was simpler and more complex than that, a spark of awareness that persisted, even as everything else was stripped away. It was the part of her that observed existence, the consciousness that preceded and would outlast all the structures built upon it. In that space of pure being, Elara understood several truths simultaneously. The first was that the Count could not truly take this from her. He could bind it, constrain it, force it into patterns of his choosing, but the essential awareness would remain. He could make her his creature, but some fragment would always observe and remember what had been done. The second truth was darker and more terrible. That persistent awareness meant she would never find the oblivion she had half hoped for. She would be conscious through every moment of her servitude, experiencing her own degradation with perfect clarity. There would be no mercy of madness or the peace of non-existence. The third truth was strangest of all. In choosing to approach the ritual without resistance or submission, without hope or despair, she had somehow cheated the binary the Count had prepared. She was being transformed, yes, but not into the broken puppet or willing servant he had intended. She was becoming something else, something he had not anticipated, because it had never occurred before in all his centuries of binding victims. She was becoming a mirror. The ritual continued, reaching its crescendo. The chanting grew louder, multiple voices joining the Count's, though there was no one else visible in the chamber. The presence Elara had sensed earlier pressed closer, its attention focused on her with crushing intensity. She felt it examining her, tasting her essence and finding something unexpected, something that did not quite fit the pattern of previous bindings. Dracula's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something that might have been concern. The ritual was not proceeding as planned. The bond was forming, yes, but it was bidirectional in a way it should not have been. As he bound Elara to himself, she was simultaneously binding him to her observation. He would not just control her, he would be witnessed by her, every action and thought exposed to the consciousness he had tried to dominate. It was not freedom, not even close, but it was a kind of mutual imprisonment neither had foreseen. The Count tried to adjust the ritual mid-process, speaking new words of power, attempting to reassert control over a working that had slipped sideways into unknown territory. But it was too late. The transformation had gained momentum beyond any single will's ability to direct. The bond snapped into place with a sensation like lightning striking flesh, and both Elara and Dracula cried out simultaneously, their voices merging into a single sound of mingled agony and revelation. Then it was over. The candles diminished to normal flames. The presence withdrew, its attention moving elsewhere. The ritual chamber became once more just a room, ancient and dark, but no longer charged with supernatural force. Elara lay on the altar, alive but fundamentally changed. She could feel the Count's presence inside her mind now, a cold weight that observed her thoughts and influenced her impulses. But she could also feel him feeling her awareness of him, an uncomfortable intimacy that violated them both. The Count stepped back, his face showing strain for the first time since she had met him. He told her it was done. She was his creature now, bound to his will, unable to disobey or defy him. But his voice lacked the triumph she had expected. There was instead a note of uncertainty, even wariness. He ordered her to rise, and she did, her body responding to his command automatically. But her mind, her essential awareness, remained separate, watching herself obey while being unable to prevent it. It was a peculiar kind of torture, being both prisoner and witness to her own captivity. He tested the bond, commanding her to perform various actions: walk to the door, kneel, raise her hands. Each command was obeyed perfectly, her body moving like a marionette. But each movement was accompanied by her crystal-clear awareness of the compulsion, the observation of her own helplessness. And through the bond, she felt his discomfort with her witnessing, his desire to have created an unconscious servant rather than a conscious mirror. The Count told her to follow him. They ascended from the ritual chamber, climbing back toward the inhabited levels of the castle. Elara's body obeyed while her mind raged uselessly, screaming protests that could not be voiced. They emerged finally in a great hall she had not seen before, its walls lined with portraits of pale figures in archaic dress. These were the other bound servants, she realized, though most were absent, scattered throughout the castle on whatever errands they were compelled to perform. Katarina was there, standing beside a window that showed the pre-dawn darkness outside. She looked at Elara with something like pity mixed with recognition. She had felt the ritual's conclusion, had sensed the strange twist it had taken. She knew what Elara had become, the unique prison she now inhabited. The pale woman offered no comfort, only the acknowledgement that comes from shared suffering. Dracula moved to a throne-like chair at the hall's far end. settling into it with visible weariness. He told Elara the curse on the village was broken, her sacrifice had been accepted, the debt paid in full. Even now, the sick were recovering, the dying were returning to health. Her village would survive and thrive, never knowing the true price of their salvation. He had kept his word, she had kept hers. The transaction was complete. But there was bitterness in his voice, the frustrated anger of one who had not received quite what was bargained for. He had wanted to consume her utterly, to extinguish her light and add her darkness to his own. Instead, he had gained a servant who would observe him eternally, whose awareness would follow his every action, reflecting back at him the monster he was. It was not the relationship he had intended, not the dynamic he had spent weeks carefully constructing. Elara felt a strange satisfaction in that, the grim pleasure of having denied him complete victory, even in defeat. She was damned, yes, bound to serve a creature of evil for an existence that might stretch for centuries, but she had not been destroyed. The essential part of her, the spark of consciousness that made her human, persisted despite everything. She had lost the battle, but in losing had somehow also prevented his total triumph. The Count dismissed her with a wave of his hand, commanding her to her chamber to rest. Her body turned and walked mechanically toward the door, but before she exited the hall, she managed something she had not expected to be possible. Through supreme effort of will, fighting against the compulsion that controlled her flesh, she forced her head to turn, to look back at the Count one final time. It was the smallest gesture, meaningless to anyone watching. But to Elara, it was proof that some fragment of autonomy remained, however microscopic. Dracula saw the movement and understood its significance. His expression darkened, but there was also a flicker of something else. Not respect exactly, but perhaps acknowledgement. She would be more difficult to control than he had anticipated. The centuries ahead would be a constant struggle, her consciousness pushing against his commands, observing and judging and maintaining a separate existence within the prison of servitude. It would be exhausting for them both, an eternal war conducted in the space between thought and action. As Elara walked through the castle's corridors toward her chamber, she became aware of sensations beyond the physical. Through the bond, she could feel the Count's emotions, and through him, the castle's other inhabitants. There were dozens of them, bound servants scattered throughout the structure, each a soul trapped in similar fashion, but none felt quite like her. Their awareness was dimmed, muted, most having given up the struggle centuries ago. They existed in a kind of half-sleep, performing their duties with minimal consciousness. She resolved in that moment that she would not follow their path. However long her captivity lasted, however many years or centuries she was forced to serve, she would maintain her awareness. She would witness everything, remember everything, be the conscience that the Count had tried to eliminate. It was not the martyrdom she had imagined when she first walked to the castle. There would be no song sung about her, no recognition of her sacrifice. The village below would forget her name within a generation, her existence reduced to legend and then less than legend, but she would know. And through the bond, the Count would know that she knew. It was a small revenge, petty in the grand scheme of eternal damnation. Yet it was hers, the one thing she had managed to preserve through the destruction of everything else she had been. Elara reached her chamber and found it transformed. The simple furnishings were gone, replaced with luxury that bordered on decadence. Silk curtains, velvet upholstery, art and objects collected over centuries. It was not a prison cell, but a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. She moved to the window and opened the curtain, looking out at the valley below where dawn was finally breaking. The village of Argesh appeared peaceful in the early light, smoke rising from chimneys as families began their day. Children would be waking, running to check on sick siblings and finding them recovered. Fever broken, appetite returned. Mothers would weep with relief. Fathers would kneel in churches, offering prayers of thanksgiving for the miracle they could not explain. Father Constantine would lead a service of celebration, never knowing that the God he praised had been absent while darker powers negotiated salvation's price. And Elara, watching from her tower prison, felt neither regret nor satisfaction. She felt only the strange numbness of having moved beyond human emotion into something else. She was no longer the girl who had walked through the gates seeking to save her village through noble sacrifice. That girl was dead, unmade, in the ritual chamber below. What remained was something new, something without precedent. Not quite human, not quite monster, but rather the space between them, eternally observing both. The sun rose higher, its light spreading across the valley but not reaching the castle, which seemed to exist in perpetual shadow despite the day's brightness. Elara felt the Count retreat to his own chambers, seeking rest during the daylight hours when his power was diminished. The bond loosened slightly with distance, giving her marginally more autonomy. She used that freedom to do the only thing she could. She wept, not for herself, though her fate was terrible enough to warrant tears, not for the Count, though his existence was perhaps the greatest tragedy of all, immortality without purpose, beyond endless hunger. She wept for the simple fact of loss, the irreversible transformation of something pure into something corrupt. She wept for her mother, who had believed faith was enough, for her father, who had not wanted to sacrifice his daughter, for Mihai, who would grow up without his sister, for Father Constantine, whose cross had been abandoned on a table, for all the human things that were beautiful precisely because they were temporary, mortal, capable of being destroyed. And she wept because she knew, with the certainty granted by her new awareness, that this was only the beginning. The Count had bound her, yes, but in doing so had also bound himself to her consciousness. Over the years and decades and centuries to come, that consciousness would work on him like water on stone, slowly eroding the certainty of his evil. She would be his conscience, unwanted and unsilenceable, forcing him to witness himself through eyes that retained some memory of humanity. It would not redeem him. Nothing could do that. The crimes of centuries could not be undone by observation alone. But it would change him, slowly and imperceptibly, in ways neither of them could predict. And in that change, however small, lay the only hope she could still cling to. Not hope for escape or salvation. Those were fantasies beyond reach, but hope that her suffering might mean something beyond the immediate transaction. Hope that consciousness itself, maintained against all odds, was its own form of resistance. The tears eventually stopped, leaving her eyes burning and her throat raw. Elara moved to the bed and lay upon it, her body exhausted beyond measure. Sleep came despite her resistance, pulling her down into darkness. And in that darkness, she dreamed not of the past or the future, but of the present moment. She dreamed of being exactly what she was, a bound creature existing in the space between two impossible states, neither fully alive nor completely dead. Neither victim nor accomplice, but rather the witness who could not look away. When she woke to the castle's eternal twilight, she would rise and begin her service. She would obey the commands given, perform the duties assigned, exist as the Count's creature in all observable ways. But in the hidden space of her consciousness, she would remain Elara, diminished and transformed but not entirely destroyed. And in maintaining that spark of separate awareness against all the forces arrayed to extinguish it, she would have won the only victory possible in a battle that could never truly be won. The village below would prosper, built on the foundation of her sacrifice. They would forget her as she had known they would, her name fading into the comfortable obscurity of legend. But she would remember them, would carry their memory through the centuries ahead, a reminder of why the sacrifice had been made even when the reason seemed hollow and the price unbearably high. And perhaps, in some future so distant it could barely be imagined, her persistence would matter. Perhaps the consciousness she fought to maintain would be the seed of something unexpected, some change or choice or consequence that justified the suffering required to preserve it. Or perhaps not. Perhaps she would endure for nothing, awareness without purpose, observation without meaning. Perhaps the Count was right, and faith was simply elaborate self-deception. Martyrdom, the ultimate vanity of those too proud to admit meaninglessness. Perhaps there was no grand design, no ultimate justice, no point to any of it beyond the immediate transaction of pain exchanged for survival. But even if that was true, even if all of it was empty, Elara knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had chosen to remain conscious rather than retreat into comfortable oblivion. She had chosen to witness and remember and maintain identity even when identity had become a curse. And in that choice, however small and futile it might be, lay something that could not be taken from her no matter how completely she was bound. She was still Elara, changed beyond recognition, damned beyond redemption, but still herself in the ways that mattered most. The Count could command her actions, but not her thoughts. He could control her body, but not her awareness. He could make her his creature in every observable sense, while the core of her remained separate, watching, waiting, enduring. And that would have to be enough, because it was all she had left.